The emergency alarm had been screaming for 6 seconds before I understood what I was looking at. My body had locked. Every muscle, every joint, every crystalline ridge along my forearms had gone rigid in the ancient paralysis my species never managed to evolve past. I could not move. I could not breathe. I could only watch through frozen eyes as Kessod lifted Desi off the ground by her throat, and the small Pelori kicked uselessly against the air with her short legs, and Professor Torvald stumbled backward into the display board with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender that meant nothing to Adratha, who had already decided the room belonged to him. But I am getting ahead of myself, and if I am going to tell you what happened that day in the classroom on Paleo 7, I need to tell you about her first. I need to tell you about the human. My name is Relic Sav. I am Velani, which means I am tall, I am thin, and I am fragile in ways that make most other species in the Galactic Concord either pity me or ignore me. My bones are hollow and laced with mineral deposits that give my skin a faint crystalline shimmer. It is beautiful, I am told. It is also about as durable as wet glass. I enrolled at the Concord Institute on Station Paleo 7 because I wanted a career in the diplomatic corps, and the institute was the most prestigious multi-species academy in 3 sectors. I was not the smartest student. I was not the bravest. I was the kind of student who sat in the middle of the classroom, took careful notes, and tried very hard not to be noticed by anything with claws. The institute held students from 42 recognized species. There were the Dratha, massive and armored, built like something between a reptile and a fortress, who walked through corridors as though the rest of us were furniture they had not yet decided to break. There were the Chivrin, insectoid and precise, who communicated in subsonic clicks that rattled my chest when I stood too close. There were the Meluuri, aquatic beings who glided through the halls in sealed hover tanks filled with their homeworld's alkaline seas. There were a dozen others, all shapes, all sizes, all carefully selected for intellect and temperament. The institute was supposed to be a place of learning and civility. We were told this on the first day. We were told this frequently. Then, at the start of my second year, they admitted the human. Her name was Marin Ortega. She arrived on the same transport shuttle as a shipment of laboratory supplies, carrying a single travel bag and a notebook made of actual paper, which several students mistook for some kind of primitive cultural artifact. She was the first human exchange student the institute had ever accepted. Earth had only recently been granted probationary membership in the Concord, and the general consensus among the student body was that this was a political gesture, rather than an academic one. Humans were classified as a pre-integration species. Their world was a Category 12 death world, which sounded impressive until you actually looked at one of them and realized they had no natural defenses worth mentioning. No venom, no claws, no dermal plating, no bioluminescent threat displays. Nothing. Marin was shorter than every species on campus except the Pelori, and even some of them had her beat. She had brown skin, dark hair she kept tied back, and an expression that defaulted to a kind of open, easy friendliness that I initially found confusing and eventually found disarming. She smiled at everyone. She asked too many questions in the dining hall about which foods would kill her and which ones would merely make her sick, and she seemed to find the distinction genuinely entertaining. She sat in the back row of every class. She doodled in her paper notebook with a small wooden writing instrument she called a pencil. She was, by every metric I could identify, the least remarkable person on the station. I was assigned to the same seminar group as Marin for Professor Torvald's class on interspecies conflict resolution. During our first introductions, she mispronounced my species name 3 times and apologized after each attempt, with such visible distress that I finally told her the mispronunciation was fine, just to make her stop. She seemed almost painfully concerned with social harmony, which I found either endearing or pathetic, and I spent several days trying to decide which. The other students did not spend much time deciding anything about her. To most of them, Marin was a curiosity at best and a political annoyance at worst. The Dratha ignored her entirely, which was their standard treatment of anything they considered beneath their attention. The Chivrin observed her with the clinical detachment of entomologists studying a new insect specimen. The Meluuri showed mild interest in the fact that humans were composed of roughly 60% water, which made them distant biological cousins of a sort. Though the Meluuri lost interest when they learned that the human version of water-based biology involved walking around on dry land breathing gaseous atmosphere, which they found both primitive and uncomfortable to think about. I overheard a group of Varsky upperclassmen discussing Marin's admission during lunch one afternoon. They were not being cruel exactly, but the tone carried a dismissiveness that did not need cruelty to sting. One of them said that admitting a human was the academic equivalent of bringing a pet to a research symposium. A nice gesture that made everyone feel progressive, but contributed nothing of substance. Another said he had reviewed the available literature on human cognitive capacity and found it adequate for a death world species, but well below Concord academic standards. They said these things loudly enough that Marin, sitting 3 tables away, could certainly hear them. She did not react. She kept eating her meal and reading something on her datapad, and if the words bothered her, she buried the evidence so deep that even I could not find it, and Veilani are excellent at reading emotional suppression because we do it constantly. The trouble started with Kessod. Kessod Varn was a third-year Drotha student from a military caste family on their homeworld of Droth Kolar. He stood nearly 3 meters tall. His hide was layered with interlocking plates of natural armor that could deflect a low-caliber plasma bolt. His jaw contained 3 rows of teeth designed for crushing bone. He had come to the institute not because he cared about diplomacy, but because his family considered it a useful addition to his military resume, and he treated the entire campus as a territory he was allowing the rest of us to occupy out of generosity. He had 2 companions who followed him everywhere, both nearly as large, both nearly as hostile, and the 3 of them moved through the institute like a storm front that everyone had learned to track and avoid. Kessod despised smaller species. He called us prey animals. He made remarks in corridors about glass bones and soft skin, and species that should have stayed in their oceans or their burrows, instead of pretending they belonged in institutions built by real civilizations. He said these things openly, casually, the way you might comment on the weather, and nobody did anything about it, because the Drotha diplomatic delegation had made it clear to the administration that their students were to be treated with appropriate cultural sensitivity, which apparently meant allowing them to terrorize everyone else without consequence. His 2 companions were named Brook and Tessov. Brook was slightly shorter than Kessov, but wider, built like a siege engine, with a permanent expression of bored menace that suggested he was always one inconvenience away from deciding that the smaller being in front of him would make a satisfying sound if he stepped on it. Tessov was leaner, faster, and had a habit of standing too close to other students in corridors and breathing slowly on them until they moved. Alone, either of them would have been the most dangerous thing on campus. Together with Kessov, they formed a triad that the rest of us navigated around the way you navigate around a structural fault in a ship's hull. You learn where it is, you give it space. You do not touch it, and you pray it does not spread. On her 3rd day at the institute, Marin Ortega sat down at Kessod's usual table in the commons. I watched it happen from across the room, my stomach's clenching. She did not know it was his table. She did not know anything. She was eating something from a sealed container she had brought from Earth. And when Kessod approached and loomed over her with his crest flared, she looked up at him and smiled, and held out a small brown square. She said it was something called chocolate, and that it was the best thing her planet had ever produced, and she wanted to share it, because she had been told that shared meals were important in most galactic cultures. Kessod took the chocolate from her hand and crushed it into powder between his fingers. He let the remnants fall onto her tray. Then he walked away without a word. Marin looked down at the ruined chocolate, looked back up at his retreating form, and shrugged. She actually shrugged. Then she went back to eating as though absolutely nothing had happened. I remember staring at her from across the commons and thinking 2 things. The first was that she was either extraordinarily brave or extraordinarily stupid. The second was that she looked very small. Not just physically, though she was certainly that. She looked small the way something looks small when it does not yet understand how large the things around it are. I felt a pang of something that might have been concern, but I told myself it was none of my business. I had my own survival to worry about. That evening, long after the commons had emptied, I saw Marin standing alone at the viewport dome on the station's upper observation deck. She was looking out at the stars, her hands in her pockets, her reflection ghosting across the transparent alloy. The light from a distant nebula caught her face, and for a moment, she looked very still and very far away. She looked very small against all that dark. I almost went to talk to her. Instead, I turned around and walked back to my quarters and told myself that the human exchange student was not my responsibility, and that whatever happened to her at the Concord Institute was simply the natural consequence of a pre-integration species reaching too far beyond its place in the galaxy. I was wrong about almost everything that night, but I would not understand that for several more weeks, and by then, everything had already begun to fall apart. The weeks that followed Marin's arrival settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal, if you did not look too closely at the cracks forming underneath. I attended my classes. I studied for my placement exams. I ate my meals in the commons and walked the corridors with my head down and my crystalline ridges tucked tight against my forearms, which is the Vellani equivalent of making yourself as small and unnoticeable as possible. It was a survival strategy I had perfected over 2 years at the Institute, and it worked well enough as long as I never forgot the fundamental rule of campus life, which was to always know where Kessod was and to never be in the same place. Marin did not seem to understand this rule, or if she did not care, which was somehow worse. We developed a cautious semi-friendship, she and I. It happened the way most things happened with Marin, which was gradually and without any apparent effort on her part. She borrowed my notes after missing a lecture because she had gotten lost in the engineering sublevel and accidentally wandered into a maintenance crawl space that she described as cozy. She asked me questions about Vellani biology, with a genuine curiosity that did not feel like academic detachment, and in return, I asked her questions about Earth that I told myself were purely xenobiological in nature. I was a student, she was a subject of study. That was all. But the things I learned about her made the back of my neck prickle in ways I could not explain. She could function on 4 hours of sleep and still be alert enough to follow a lecture on quantum diplomacy. I watched her do this repeatedly. My species requires 9 hours of deep rest, or our cognitive functions degrade to the point where we cannot form sentences. 4 hours would leave me functionally comatose. Marin did it as though it were mildly inconvenient and nothing more. She healed from injuries at a rate that I found quietly alarming. She cut her finger on a broken lab instrument during our second week of sharing a seminar group, and by the following week, the wound had closed completely, leaving only a thin pink line that was already fading. When I mentioned this to a Meluwari classmate, he told me that human tissue regeneration was considered unremarkable by Deathworld standards. I told him that on my homeworld, a cut that deep would take 3 months to fully mend, and might leave a permanent structural weakness in the surrounding crystal. He looked at me the way people look at something fragile, and I hated it, and I changed the subject. She ate everything, not just the foods designated safe for human consumption in the dining hall, but things that were mildly toxic to 3 other species. She consumed capsaicin, which is a chemical weapon produced by certain earth plants, as a flavor additive. She called it hot sauce. She put it on her morning protein ration and offered me some with the casual friendliness of someone who did not realize they were offering me a chemical irritant. I declined. She shrugged and poured more on her food. One evening, while we were studying together in the library, she mentioned that she had played something called rugby at her university on Earth. She said it was a sport. She said it casually, the way you might mention a hobby. That night, alone in my quarters, I searched the term on the data net and found video footage of humans slamming into each other at full speed, without any protective equipment, driving each other into the ground, getting up with blood running from their faces, and continuing to play. I watched a human take an impact that would have killed a Vellani instantly, stand up, spit something red onto the grass, and run back into the formation. My stomach's turned. I did not sleep well. I began to notice something else about Marin in those weeks. She was watching things, not in the distracted way that most students observe their surroundings, but with a focused, cataloging attention that reminded me of how the Chivrin processed information, quietly absorbing and filing every detail for later retrieval. She watched how students moved through the corridors. She watched the social hierarchies, the unspoken rules, the invisible boundaries that kept the prey-evolved species on one side of the commons and the predator-evolved species on the other. She watched the way everyone tracked Kessod's movements, the way conversations went quiet when he passed, the way the administration looked the other way. She stopped smiling as much. I noticed this gradually, the way you notice a change in the weather not by a single moment, but by the accumulation of small differences. She still spoke with warmth when addressed directly. She still laughed at the Meluuri's dry humor during study sessions, and patiently answered Desi's endless questions about Earth's oceans. But the default expression she wore between interactions shifted from open friendliness to something quieter and more watchful. She spent longer periods in the library, staying late after the rest of us had left. And when I passed her table, I saw that she was not always studying coursework. Sometimes she was reading xenobiology databases, flipping through anatomical reference files with the systematic focus of someone memorizing a map. Once I caught a glimpse of her screen showing a detailed skeletal diagram of a species I recognized immediately. It was a Dratha. She saw me looking and switched to a different file without comment. Neither of us mentioned it. Meanwhile, Kessod's behavior was getting worse. The incidents had been escalating for months, even before Marin's arrival, but now they were happening with a frequency and a brazenness that suggested he had realized there would be no consequences and had decided to test exactly how far that immunity extended. He cornered a Chivrin student named Fial in the laboratory wing and told him to give up his assigned research station. When Fial tried to refuse, Kessod leaned down until his inner jaw was centimeters from Fial's sensory antennae and released a low-frequency growl that triggered an involuntary defensive curl in the Chivrin's exoskeleton. Fial spent 3 hours locked in that position before the medical staff could coax him out of it. Kessod told the administration it was a misunderstanding. 2 weeks later, Kessod accidentally cracked the hover tank casing of a Meluuri student named Savon while passing him in a corridor. The crack was small, but it was enough to begin leaking the alkaline solution that kept Savon alive. By the time other students found him, Savon's gill membranes were already beginning to dry, and he was making a high-pitched distress call that I could hear from 3 corridors away. The medical team repaired the tank and saved Savon's life, but he was moved to a different residential section afterward, and I heard he requested a transfer back to his homeworld that was still pending. Reports were filed, complaints were logged. The Dratha diplomatic delegation intervened every time, issuing formal statements about cultural misunderstandings and the need for patience during interspecies integration. The administration accepted these statements the way they accepted everything the Dratha said, with polite nods and closed files, and a silent understanding that the political cost of confronting the Dratha was higher than the cost of a few broken students. I was furious. I was also terrified, which is a combination that produces a very specific kind of self-loathing in a Vailani. We are not built for confrontation. Our fear response is biological, hardwired, a muscular paralysis that locks every joint in our bodies when we detect a predator-class threat. I could not have stood up to Kessod, even if I had wanted to. My body would not have allowed it, and so I did what every other prey-evolved student on campus did. I stayed quiet. I stayed small. I survived. Marin watched all of it. One evening in the library, after I had spent 20 minutes complaining about the Savon incident in the low whisper that had become my default volume when discussing anything related to Kessod, Marin set down her pencil and looked at me with an expression I could not read. She asked me a question. She asked it simply, without judgment, without accusation, but it landed in my chest like a stone. She asked, "Has anyone here ever actually stood up to him?" I stared at her. Then I explained, as calmly as I could, that Kessod was an apex predator, from a species that had conquered 3 star systems, through military dominance, before they even discovered faster-than-light travel. He was twice the mass of most students on campus. His skeletal structure was reinforced with a calcium-titanium composite that made his bones effectively unbreakable. His species possessed chemical signaling capabilities that could trigger involuntary terror responses in every prey-evolved species on the station. Standing up to a Dratha was not a matter of courage. It was a matter of biology. It was physically, neurologically, chemically impossible for most of us to even remain conscious in the presence of a Dratha threat display, let alone fight back. Marin listened to all of this. She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Yeah, that tracks." I did not know what that phrase meant, and she did not explain it. 3 days later, Kessod came for me. It happened in the corridor outside the science wing, in the gap between afternoon classes when the halls were mostly empty. I was walking alone, my notes clutched against my chest, thinking about the placement exam I had the following week, when a shadow fell over me, and I looked up and Kessod was there. His two companions flanked the corridor behind me. I was boxed in. He did not say much. He did not need to. He told me that he had noticed me talking to the human, and that he found it amusing that two prey animals had found each other, and that he wanted me to understand something about how the natural order worked. Then he shoved me into the wall. The impact cracked one of the crystalline ridges on my left forearm, a sound like breaking ice that echoed off the metal walls. Pain flooded through me in a white wave, and my body did what it always did. It locked. I fell against the wall, rigid and helpless, and Kessod leaned down and told me not to report this to anyone. He said that glass things should be careful about drawing attention to themselves. Then he walked away, and his companions walked with him, and I stood frozen in the corridor for 11 minutes before the paralysis released and I could move again. 11 minutes. I counted them afterward when I checked the corridor's time display. 11 minutes of standing rigid against a wall with a cracked ridge sending pain signals through my nervous system that I could feel but could not respond to. 11 minutes of staring at the place where Kessod had been and being unable to close my eyes or look away, or do anything at all except exist inside a body that had decided, on my behalf and without my consent, that the safest thing to do was to stop being a person and become a statue instead. When the paralysis finally released, it came all at once, and I crumpled to the floor like something whose supports had been removed. I sat there with my cracked ridge cradled against my chest, and I hated myself with a clarity and a thoroughness that I had not previously known I was capable of. I hated my body for freezing. I hated my species for evolving a defense mechanism that was indistinguishable from surrender. I hated the Institute for admitting me into a place where I could be broken in a corridor and no one would know for 11 minutes. I sat there and I hated everything, and the hate accomplished nothing, because hate without the ability to act on it is just another form of paralysis. Marin found me 20 minutes later, sitting on the floor of the corridor with my cracked ridge cradled against my chest. I do not know how she knew where I was. She did not ask me what happened, because the answer was obvious. She looked at my arm, and something in her face changed. It was subtle, a tightening around her jaw, a stillness in her eyes that reminded me of the way the station's blast doors sealed before a hull breach. She did not say anything. She helped me to my feet, walked me to the medical bay, and sat with me while the medic applied a bonding agent to my ridge. She was very quiet the entire time. Not the comfortable quiet of someone with nothing to say, the loaded quiet of someone with too much to say, and a very specific reason for keeping it inside. That night, I heard from another student that Marin had gone to the administration office and filed a formal complaint against Kessod on my behalf. She had included the incident with File, the incident with Sevon, and 3 other incidents she had apparently documented without telling anyone. She had cited specific provisions of the Institute's charter regarding student safety and administrative responsibility. She had requested an emergency review. The complaint was rejected within the hour. Insufficient evidence, the administration said. The Drotha delegation had already intervened with a preemptive statement about cultural context and species-specific behavioral norms. I found out later that Marin had sat in the Commons after receiving the rejection notice. She sat at a table by herself, her datapad in front of her, the official response glowing on the screen. Several students who passed by told me she was just sitting there, not moving, not speaking, her face completely still. I would learn later that humans have a phrase for that expression. They call it the calm before the storm. It is the moment just before everything breaks open, when the air goes flat and the pressure drops, and every animal on Earth with any survival instinct at all knows to find shelter. None of us had that instinct. None of us recognized what we were looking at. We should have. I need to tell you exactly how it happened, because the official reports got it wrong, and the unofficial accounts that spread across the data net afterward turned it into something it was not. It was not a performance. It was not a display of human superiority. It was not some calculated demonstration designed to announce humanity's arrival on the galactic stage. It was a Tuesday morning in Professor Torvon's seminar room, and a girl who weighed less than most of the furniture in the room decided that she was done watching people get hurt. The class was interspecies conflict resolution. The irony of that has not faded with time. I arrived early because arriving early meant I could choose a seat near the exit, which had become my standard practice in any room that also contained Kessod. The seminar room was a tiered amphitheater with curved desks arranged in ascending rows, a display wall at the front, and two doors, one at the bottom near the lectern and one at the top of the highest row. Kessod always sat in the front row with his two companions, a positioning that was less about academic enthusiasm and more about territorial dominance. The rest of us arranged ourselves around and above him like small animals, clustered on the high branches of a tree, trying to stay above the predator on the forest floor. Marin was already in her usual spot in the back row, her paper notebook open, her pencil in her hand. She glanced up when I came in, and we exchanged a brief nod. She looked the same as always, calm, attentive, unremarkable. There was a small adhesive bandage on her left hand, where she had burned herself in the chemistry lab the previous day, and I remember noticing it, and thinking that humans were bizarrely fragile for a species that came from a death world. Professor Torvan was a Varsky, tall and spindly, with a reedy voice that carried well in the amphitheater. He was a good teacher, patient and thorough, and he had spent 30 years studying interspecies communication breakdowns. He was also, I had realized over the past 2 years, someone who avoided confrontation with the same desperate intensity that the rest of us did. He knew what Kessod was doing. Everyone knew. But knowing and acting are different things, and most people on that station had decided a long time ago which one they were willing to do. The topic that day was de-escalation across predator-prey species dynamics. Torvan opened by discussing the biological factors that make interspecies conflict uniquely dangerous in mixed environments. The pheromone responses, the hardwired fight-or-flight mechanisms, the sensory mismatches that can turn a minor disagreement into a lethal encounter. He was clinical about it, detached, presenting it the way he presented everything, as an academic problem to be solved with protocols and procedures. Then he made a mistake. He used a real example. He did not name anyone. He said something about recent interpersonal tensions within this institution, and how they illustrated the challenges of predator-prey coexistence in shared academic spaces. It was vague. It was careful. It was intended to be a teaching moment wrapped in enough abstraction that no one could take offense. Kessod took offense. He stood up in a single motion that sent his desk sliding sideways across the floor with a shriek of metal. The sound alone was enough to trigger the first wave of fear responses across the room. I felt my forearms go rigid, the crystalline ridges locking together in the opening stage of paralysis. 2 shivering students in the middle rows began curling into defensive postures, their exoskeletons clicking shut like closing doors. A Meluuri student near me made a sound through his tank speakers that I had never heard before, high and thin and afraid. Kessod was standing with his full crest extended. The bony plates along the back of his skull had flared outward, nearly doubling the apparent size of his head. His inner jaw was visible behind his outer teeth, and the secondary set of mandibles were spread wide in the full Dratha threat display, a posture that evolution had designed to paralyze prey species at close range. The effect was chemical as much as visual. Dratha produce a cocktail of pheromones during a threat display that interact with the fear receptors of most prey-evolved species in the Concord. The scent hit us like a wave. I felt it wash over my brain, cold and electric, and my body responded the way 100,000 years of evolution had programmed it to respond. I froze. Every muscle locked. My vision narrowed to a tunnel with Kessod at its center, and I could not move, could not speak, could not do anything except watch. Professor Torvan stumbled backward. His hands came up in a reflexive gesture of submission, palms outward, body curling inward. He hit the display board behind him and pressed himself against it. His mouth was moving, but no sound was coming out. Kessod's 2 companions stood simultaneously, and they moved to the 2 doors. The one at the bottom sealed the exit near the lectern. The other climbed the stairs and blocked the door at the top. The room was closed. Then Kessod reached sideways and grabbed the nearest student. It was Desi. She was a Pelori, barely a meter tall, covered in soft gray fur, with enormous dark eyes that made up nearly a third of her face. She weighed maybe 30 kilograms. Kessod lifted her off the ground, with one hand wrapped around her neck, and Desi's small legs kicked against the air, and she made a sound that I will never forget for as long as I live. It was a whistling, choking cry that cut through the chemical fog in my brain, like a blade, but still could not break through the paralysis that held my body in place. Kessod spoke. His voice was deep and resonant, filling the amphitheater the way a rockfall fills a canyon. He said he was done. He said he was done pretending that glass creatures and water breathers and insect things deserved to sit in the same rooms as real species. He said the Institute was a joke, and the Concord was a joke, and every species that could not survive a single blow from his fist had no right to share air with those who could. He shook Desi as he spoke, and her small body swung like something hollow, and the choking sound continued, getting weaker. Professor Torvan hit the emergency alert panel on the wall. A red light began strobing. Somewhere in the station, security officers received the signal. But security was stationed 3 decks below, and the fastest response time from that distance was 4 minutes, and Desi's face was already changing color. I wanted to move. I want you to understand that. I wanted to stand up and do something, anything, and my body would not let me. I was locked in my seat, my arms pressed against my sides, my jaw clenched shut so hard that my back teeth ached. The paralysis was total and absolute, and it was not a choice. It was biology. It was what I was built to do when a predator decided I was prey. And then, in the back row, Marin Ortega stood up. She did it slowly. Not the explosive lurch of someone acting on impulse, but the deliberate, measured movement of someone who had made a decision and was now carrying it out. She closed her notebook. She set her pencil down on the desk beside it. She pushed her chair back. She stood. And then she walked forward, down the stairs between the rows, toward the front of the room where Kessod held Desi in the air. She walked. She did not run. The Dratha pheromones that had locked every other conscious being in the room into rigid, trembling immobility did not seem to affect her at all. I watched her pass through the invisible chemical cloud that was pressing against my nervous system, like a hand around my brain, and she did not flinch, did not stumble, did not even seem to notice it. I learned later that humans lack the receptor pathways that Dratha pheromones target. The chemical signaling that evolution had turned into a weapon against every prey species in the Concord simply had no mechanism to latch onto in a human nervous system. It was like trying to hack a system that ran on a completely different operating language. The attack connected with nothing. It passed through her like light through glass. Marin stopped about 3 meters from Kessod. Desi was still dangling from his grip, her kicks getting weaker. The room was silent except for the strobing alarm and the wet, whistling sound of the pylori trying to breathe. Marin spoke. She said, "Put her down." Her voice was calm, conversational. She could have been asking someone to pass a plate across a dinner table. There was no tremor in it, no aggression, just a simple, clear instruction, delivered with the quiet expectation that it would be obeyed. Kessod turned his head and looked at her. I could see his expression even from my frozen vantage point in the middle row, and what I saw there was not anger, it was amusement. This was a creature roughly half his height, with no claws, no armor, no visible weaponry of any kind. Her skin was bare and soft. Her bones, as far as he knew, were as breakable as mine. She was standing in front of him, making demands the way a pebble might make demands of a landslide. He laughed. It was a deep, grinding sound that vibrated through the floor. He tossed Desi aside, and the pylori hit the edge of a desk and crumpled to the floor in a heap of gray fur and labored breathing. Then Kessod turned his full attention to Marin, expanded his crest to its maximum span, dropped his stance into the Dratha combat posture, and waited for her to do what every other species in the galaxy did when a Dratha decided they were worth killing. Marin did not flinch. She did not step back. What happened next lasted 63 seconds. I know because the security footage was time-stamped, but it felt like it happened outside of time entirely, in some compressed, airless space where the normal rules of the universe had been suspended and replaced with something older and more frightening. Kessod lunged. He was fast, terrifyingly fast for something his size, and his clawed hand swept toward Marin's head, in a strike that would have taken it from her shoulders. But Marin was not where his hand arrived. She had dropped low, below the arc of his swing, and driven forward into his center mass with her shoulder. She was using leverage and momentum, turning his own weight and velocity against him, and the impact staggered him sideways by a full step. It should not have been possible. She weighed a fraction of what he did, but she hit him at the right angle, at the right moment, with her entire body behind the point of contact, and physics did not care about size when the math was right. Kessod recovered and swung again. Marin ducked under the strike, caught his arm, and redirected his momentum into the nearest desk. The desk exploded into fragments. Kessod roared, a sound that rattled the walls, and came at her again. This time Marin met him head-on. She struck him in the throat with the heel of her palm, a sharp, precise blow that caught the gap between his lower jaw plates. Then she kicked the side of his knee, targeting the joint where his natural armor was thinnest. Kessod buckled, not much, just enough for Marin to get inside his reach again and drive her elbow into his solar plexus. She knew his anatomy. That was the thing that broke through my paralysis just enough for me to think a coherent thought. She knew exactly where the gaps in his plating were. She knew where his joints bent and where they did not. She knew the nerve clusters, the soft tissue, the structural weaknesses that the Dratha never talked about, because no one had ever been close enough to exploit them. She had studied him. She had studied all of them. She had learned Dratha anatomy the same way she had learned everything else at the Institute, quietly, thoroughly, in the back row with her paper notebook, and she had never told anyone. One of Kessod's companions abandoned his position at the upper door and charged down the stairs toward her. He hit Marin from behind with a running tackle that lifted her off her feet and slammed her into the lectern. The lectern shattered. Marin hit the floor and rolled, and when she came up there was blood on her face. A gash had opened above her left eyebrow, and the blood was running down her cheek and dripping off her jaw, and it was red. Impossibly vividly red, a color that looked almost alien against the muted tones of the seminar room. She did not stop. She did not slow down. If anything, she got faster. I learned later that humans have a chemical response to pain and danger that they call adrenaline. It floods their system with a compound that increases their strength, their speed, and their pain tolerance, sometimes to levels that border on the biologically improbable. Marin was running on a full adrenaline cascade, and I watched her fight two Dratha simultaneously, with blood running into her eye, and her hands raw and split, and she did not stop. She used the broken furniture as barriers, forcing the Dratha to maneuver around obstacles that she could slip through. She used the confined space of the amphitheater to prevent them from flanking her. She used the stairs, the desk fragments, the walls themselves as tools, bouncing off surfaces to redirect her movement, ducking through gaps that the larger Dratha could not follow. It was not brute force. It was intelligence applied to combat with a precision that made my chest ache with something between terror and awe. She broke the companion's wrist joint with a targeted strike that twisted the armored plate past its range of motion. The Dratha screamed, a sound I had never heard a Dratha make, and stumbled back, clutching his arm. Marin spun and drove the second companion into the wall with a combination of strikes that targeted the same nerve cluster she had hit on Kessod, and then she hooked her foot behind his ankle and brought him down. His head hit the wall on the way to the floor with a sound like a hammer striking stone. Then she turned back to Kessod. He was getting up. Of course he was getting up. He was Dratha, and the Dratha did not stay down, and he was looking at Marin with an expression that had shifted from amusement to something I had never seen on a Dratha face before. I think it was disbelief. I think, for the first time in his life, he was looking at something smaller than him and not understanding why it was still standing. Marin hit him once more. It was a single, devastating strike delivered with her entire body behind it, aimed at the nerve cluster behind his bony crest, a location that was not in any publicly available anatomy database I had ever seen. She had found it on her own, through research or observation, or some combination of both, and she hit it with a precision that suggested she had been thinking about this moment for a long time. Kessod went down. He hit the floor with a impact that I felt through the soles of my feet, and he did not get up. The room was silent. The alarm was still strobing. The chemical fog of Dratha pheromones was beginning to dissipate, and I could feel the first tremors of movement returning to my limbs. the paralysis releasing its grip one muscle fiber at a time. Marin was standing in the middle of the front row, breathing hard, surrounded by 3 fallen Dratha and the wreckage of half the classroom furniture. Blood was running from the gash on her forehead and from the split skin across both sets of knuckles. Her shirt was torn at the shoulder. She was shaking, a fine tremor that ran through her whole body, and I realized later that it was not fear. It was the adrenaline beginning to metabolize, the chemical aftermath of what her body had just done. She looked around the room at the paralyzed, terrified faces of 26 students and 1 professor. Then she turned away from us and walked to where Desi lay curled on the floor beside the broken desk. She knelt down. She checked the Pelori's breathing with gentle, careful hands, the same hands that had just put 3 Dratha on the ground. Then she sat down on the floor beside Desi and took the small alien's hand in her own, and she held it, and she waited. When security arrived 4 minutes later, they found Marin Ortega sitting on the floor of the seminar room with blood drying on her face and a Pelori's hand in hers. She looked up at the lead officer with an expression that was neither proud nor apologetic. She said, "The 3 Dratha assaulted a student. I intervened. I would like to file a report, please." My paralysis released fully. About 30 seconds after that, I sat in my seat, with my arms trembling and my heart's hammering behind my sternum, and I stared at the human in the front of the room. This quiet, small, smiling girl who doodled in notebooks made of dead trees and mispronounced my species name and offered chocolate to strangers. This girl who sat in the back row of every class and asked too many questions about food and seemed so completely, thoroughly unremarkable that most of the campus had forgotten she existed. I had never been so wrong about anything in my life. The 3 days following the incident moved with the strange, distorted speed of a decompression event, everything happening at once and nothing happening fast enough. I could not stop thinking about what I had seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marin standing in the middle of the wrecked seminar room with blood on her face and calm in her voice, and my brain kept trying to reconcile that image with the quiet girl who had asked me how to pronounce Veilani and apologized 3 times for getting it wrong. Kessod and his 2 companions were in the medical ward. The reports circulated through the student body like wildfire carried on a data net breeze, each detail more startling than the last. Marin had fractured Kessod's knee plate, which was a joint structure that Dratha military engineers had spent decades trying to find a way to compromise. She had collapsed a secondary breathing membrane in his companion's throat, which required surgical intervention to repair. She had caused a nerve cluster shutdown behind Kessod's crest that took medical staff nearly 2 full days to reverse using targeted electrical stimulation. The doctors said the shutdown was caused by a single precise blow to a point that was not referenced in any standard xenobiology textbook available to students. When someone asked the head physician how a human had managed this, the physician paused for a long time before saying that whoever had done it must have had access to Dratha military medical literature or conducted independent anatomical research of considerable depth, or both. Marin had done it with a pencil and a paper notebook, and whatever she could find in the Institute's open-access library. The Dratha diplomatic delegation responded within hours. Their statement was delivered by Ambassador Goran Vass, a massive, stone-faced Dratha, whose voice filled the administrative chamber like the rumble of tectonic activity. He demanded Marin's immediate expulsion. He demanded criminal charges under Concord law for aggravated assault on citizens of a sovereign member species. He demanded that Earth's probationary membership be reviewed and potentially revoked. He called Marin a dangerous primitive from an unregulated death world, and he said that her presence at the Institute was an ongoing threat to the safety of civilized students. The Institute convened an emergency disciplinary board. The hearing was held in the main assembly chamber, a cavernous room designed for formal Concord proceedings, with tiered observation galleries and a central floor where the respondents sat at a single table facing the adjudication panel. I attended as a witness, along with 19 other students from the seminar. Desi was there too, her neck still bruised and her voice still hoarse, sitting in the front row of the gallery with her enormous dark eyes fixed on the proceedings with an intensity that made her look like a completely different creature than the fragile Pelori I had known. Marin sat alone at the respondents' table. She was wearing a clean uniform, The gash on her forehead had been sealed with a thin medical adhesive that caught the light when she turned her head. Her knuckles were still raw and discolored beneath fresh bandaging. She did not have a legal advocate. Earth's Concord membership was too new for them to have appointed a legal attaché to the station, and the Institute's internal advocacy office had declined to represent her, citing a conflict of interest that they did not elaborate on. She was alone. She represented herself. Ambassador Gorin opened the proceedings with a presentation that was clearly rehearsed and designed for maximum emotional impact, at least among Drotha sensibilities. He described Marin's actions as a premeditated attack on 3 students who had been engaged in vigorous but culturally appropriate discourse. He characterized her fighting ability as evidence of concealed military training, suggesting that Earth had sent a combat operative disguised as an exchange student. He demanded that the board recognize the fundamental incompatibility of human temperament with civilized interspecies society. The panel listened. They took notes. They looked grave. Then it was Marin's turn. She stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture or posture or pace. She spoke the way she had spoken in the seminar room, calm and clear and conversational, as though she were discussing a moderately interesting assignment, rather than fighting for her place in the galaxy. She began by producing the formal complaint she had filed 3 days before the incident. She had the timestamp, the filing number, the administrative response. She read the response into the record. It said, "Insufficient evidence." She let that phrase sit in the silence for a moment before moving on. Then she produced her documentation. She had been keeping records since her 2nd week at the Institute. Dates, times, locations, species of victims, nature of each incident, names of witnesses. She had documented 12 separate acts of aggression by Kessod and his companions over the preceding 4 months. She had the incident with File, the Chivrin who had been locked in a defensive curl for 3 hours. She had the incident with Savan, the Melawuri whose hover tank had been cracked. She had my incident, the cracked crystalline ridge and the corridor ambush. She had 9 others that I had not even known about, smaller cruelties that had been absorbed and forgotten by students who had learned that reporting them was pointless. She presented each one. She was thorough. She was precise. She did not editorialize or dramatize. She simply laid the facts on the table one after another, like stones being stacked into a wall. Then she requested the security footage from the seminar room. The board had it. The footage showed exactly what had happened, from the moment Kessod stood and deployed his threat display to the moment Marin said she would like to file a report. It showed Kessod grabbing Desi. It showed the 2 companions sealing the exits. It showed every student in the room locked in biological paralysis. It showed Professor Torvan pressed against the wall, unable to move or speak. And it showed Marin, the only person in the room still standing, closing her notebook and walking forward. The footage was played in its entirety. No one in the chamber spoke. When it ended, Marin cited 3 specific provisions of the Institute's charter. Provision 4.7, the duty of students to render aid to fellow students in immediate physical danger when institutional security is unavailable. Provision 8.3, the right of any individual to use proportional force in defense of another when no alternative exists. And Provision 12.1, the institutional responsibility to maintain a safe learning environment for all enrolled species, which she noted had been systematically violated for the entire duration of Kessod's enrollment. She had read the charter. She had read the entire charter. She had memorized the relevant sections. Ambassador Gorin interrupted to demand how she had been able to defeat 3 Dratha in physical combat. His tone suggested that the answer would prove his military operative theory. Marin turned to face him directly, and I watched something shift in her posture, a squaring of her shoulders, and a settling of her weight that was so subtle I almost missed it. She was not intimidated. She was not performing. She was simply present, in her body, in the moment, with a kind of grounded certainty that I had never seen in any species. She explained. She was not a military operative. She was a biology student from the University of Sao Paulo, with a minor in comparative anatomy. She explained that humans evolved as persistence predators on a high-gravity world with extreme environmental variation, and that this evolutionary history had produced a species with unusual endurance, high pain tolerance, an acute adrenaline response system, and the ability to continue functioning at near-peak capacity while sustaining significant physical damage. She said these things without pride or aggression. She said them the way you might describe the weather on your homeworld, as facts that simply were. Then she explained that she had studied Dratha anatomy as part of her coursework in comparative xenobiology. She had studied everyone's anatomy. She had studied the Chivran exoskeletal locking mechanism. She had studied Vellani crystalline ridge composition. She had studied pylori respiratory systems, and Meluuri gill membrane chemistry, and Varsky joint articulation. She said that understanding the species around her seemed like the responsible thing to do when you were living among them. She said it as though this were obvious, as though everyone would naturally spend their free time learning the biological architecture of their classmates in case they ever needed to help one of them, or protect them, or put someone who was hurting them on the ground. Then she said something that silenced the chamber. She said that on Earth, where she came from, there was a concept that did not translate perfectly into galactic common. She said the closest approximation was this: those who have the ability to act have the responsibility to act. She said she had watched Kessod hurt people for weeks. She said she had watched the system fail to protect them. She said she had filed reports and watched them get rejected. She said she had followed every procedure, every protocol, every civilized mechanism that the Institute offered, and none of them had worked. She said she would not watch it happen again. She said she was not sorry for what she had done. She was sorry she had to do it at all. The chamber was quiet for a long time after she finished speaking. Ambassador Goran's jaw was tight, and his crest was partially raised, but he did not speak. The panel members looked at each other. The evidence was overwhelming, and every diplomat in the room knew it. The deliberation took 2 hours. The Dratha delegation threatened diplomatic consequences. They threatened trade reviews. They threatened military repositioning along 3 contested border zones. The threats were real, and everyone in the room understood that yielding to them was the easier path. The panel expelled Kessod and his 2 companions, permanently. They issued a formal reprimand to Marin for disproportionate application of force, which was a political compromise that everyone recognized as such, and which changed nothing. Marin accepted the reprimand without argument. She remained enrolled. The reaction on campus was immediate and divided along lines that surprised me. I had expected the predator-evolved species to rally behind the Dratha and the prey-evolved species to rally behind Marin, but that was not what happened. The response cut across biological categories in ways that the old hierarchy could not have predicted. A Varsky professor named Len, who had never spoken to Marin before the hearing, stopped her in the corridor afterward and told her that what she had done in the seminar room was the first time in his 20-year career at the Institute that he had seen anyone treat the Charter's protection clauses as something more than decorative language. A Dratha student, not one of Kessod's group, but a quiet 4th year named Theric, who had kept her head down for her own reasons, sought Marin out in the library and told her that Kessod's behavior had embarrassed every Dratha on the station who believed their species could be more than what their military caste had made them. Theric said this quietly, and she left quickly afterward, and Marin sat still for a long time after she was gone. The Dratha delegation was not finished, of course. Ambassador Goran filed a formal protest with the Concord Secretariat within hours of the ruling, and the diplomatic channels buzzed with threats and counter-threats that I would only learn about months later. But on the campus itself, something had shifted that no diplomatic filing could reverse. Students who had spent years navigating the Institute's invisible hierarchy with careful, practiced avoidance were beginning to look at each other differently. The paralysis was not just a Vellani condition, I realized. Every prey species on the station had their own version of it, their own biological or psychological mechanism for making themselves small in the presence of something larger. And all of them had just watched a creature smaller than most of them walk through the worst a Dratha could offer and come out the other side still standing, still speaking, still refusing to accept that the system's failure was acceptable. I went to see Marin afterward. She was in her quarters, sitting on the edge of her bunk with her elbows on her knees and her bandaged hands hanging between them. She looked tired for the first time since I had known her. Not the tired of insufficient sleep, which she handled with disturbing ease, but a deeper tired, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time and finally setting it down. I asked her if she had been afraid during the fight. She laughed. It was a strange, wet sound, not quite a laugh, and not quite something else, and it caught in her throat before it finished. She said she had been terrified. She said she had been terrified from the moment she stood up until the moment security walked through the door. She said her hands had been shaking so badly she could barely close her notebook, and that the only reason she had been able to walk down those stairs was because she had locked her knees and refused to let them buckle. I asked her how she had fought like that while terrified. She looked at me with those dark, quiet eyes, and she said, "That is what humans do. We are always afraid. We just do things anyway." I sat with her for a while after that. We did not talk much. I watched her unwrap the bandaging on her knuckles and flex her raw, bruised fingers with a wince she tried to hide. I asked if they would heal. She looked at her hands, turned them over, and shrugged the same way she had shrugged when Kessod crushed her chocolate on that first day. "They will heal," she said. "We are good at that too." 6 weeks after Kessod was expelled from the Concord Institute, I sat in the Commons during the midday break and tried to identify the exact moment the world had changed. I could not find it. Not because it had not happened, but because it had happened so gradually and so completely that looking for a single turning point was like trying to find the exact second when dawn becomes day. You cannot. The light just arrives, and then everything is different, and you realize you have been seeing in the dark for longer than you thought. The Commons itself looked the same curved tables, the same filtered station light falling through the viewport panels, the same hum of recycled atmosphere through the ventilation ducts. But the people in it were different, or maybe they had always been the same, and were only now allowing themselves to show it. A Chivrin student named File, the one Kessod had cornered in the laboratory wing and locked into a defensive curl that lasted 3 hours, was sitting at a table near the center of the room with 2 Veilani students I recognized from the science cohort. They were working on a joint research project, something about crystalline molecular bonding that I did not pretend to understand, and File was making subsonic clicks of enthusiasm that rattled the table surface, while the Veilani students leaned in and pointed at data displays and talked over each other in the way that people do when they are excited and have forgotten to be afraid. A Meluturi student named Sevon, the one whose hover tank had been cracked in the corridor, was gliding past the food stations with a pilori perched on the upper rail of his tank, her short legs dangling over the side of the glass. They were arguing about music. I did not know that Melusuri and Pilori could argue about music, or that they would want to, or that the argument would involve the Pilori singing fragments of traditional songs in a high, clear voice, while the Melusuri played counter-melodies through his tank speakers, in an attempt to prove that bass harmonics were structurally superior to vocal range. They had been doing this for 20 minutes. Neither of them was winning. Both of them seemed happy. These things had not happened before. The species mixing, the casual conversations across biological categories, the willingness to sit in the middle of the room instead of pressed against the walls and clustered by species type. Before the fight, the Commons had been a map of invisible territories, predator species in the center, prey species at the edges, everyone carefully occupying their designated place in a hierarchy that nobody talked about and everybody obeyed. That map had dissolved. Not all at once, and not completely, but enough that the room felt different in a way that was hard to name and impossible to miss. Marin was responsible. Not because she had told anyone to change, or organized any movement, or made any speeches about interspecies unity. She had not. She had gone back to sitting in the back row of her classes, with her notebook open and her pencil in her hand, and she had resumed her habit of asking too many questions about food in the dining hall, and she had continued to be, by every surface measure, the same unremarkable human she had been before everything happened. But the story had spread. Not just through the Institute, not just through the station, but outward, carried on data net channels and diplomatic communications, and the informal gossip networks that connected every species in the Concord. The human exchange student who had fought 3 Dratha and won. The small, soft-skinned creature with no natural weapons, who had walked through a chemical weapon designed to paralyze every prey species in the galaxy, and had not even noticed it. The girl who had studied anatomy textbooks in her free time and memorized the weak points of every species on campus, and used that knowledge not to threaten anyone, but to protect a Pelori she had barely spoken to. The story changed how people looked at Marin, but more importantly, it changed how people looked at each other. I think I understood why on the morning that Professor Torvan invited Marin to co-lead a special seminar session on human conflict ethics. I attended, of course. The amphitheater was full, standing room only, packed with students from species that did not normally take Professor Torvan's class, and a handful of faculty members who had cleared their schedules. The seminar room had been repaired. New desks, new lectern. The wall where Kessod's companion had left a crack had been patched, but if you looked closely, you could still see the seam where the new panel met the old one. Marin stood at the front of the room in her standard uniform with her notebook on the lectern and her pencil behind her ear, and she talked about Earth. She talked about human history. She said that humans had spent most of their existence fighting each other with increasing creativity and efficiency, developing methods of destruction that grew more sophisticated with every generation. She said that humans had built weapons capable of rendering their entire planet uninhabitable, and then they had sat across tables from each other and negotiated agreements to not use them. She said that the same species that had perfected the art of war had also perfected the art of choosing not to wage it, and that this second achievement was, in her opinion, considerably more impressive than the first. She talked about concepts that did not have clean equivalents in Galactic Common. She used the word justice, and then spent several minutes trying to explain what it meant, because the Galactic translation software rendered it as proportional consequence allocation, which she said missed the point entirely. Justice, she said, was not about proportion. It was about the belief that every being, regardless of their size or their species or their place in any hierarchy, deserved to be treated with a basic dignity that could not be revoked by those who were larger or stronger or more politically connected. She talked about solidarity. She described it as the decision to treat someone else's suffering as your own problem even when it technically was not, even when walking away would be easier, even when the cost of staying was higher than anyone could reasonably expect you to pay. She said humans had a long and complicated history with this concept. Sometimes they lived up to it. Often they did not. But the idea persisted, she said. It kept coming back, generation after generation, refusing to die, no matter how many times they failed it. She talked about moral courage. She said it was different from physical courage, harder and rarer and more important. She said physical courage was the ability to face danger without running. Moral courage was the ability to face injustice without looking away. She said the galaxy was full of species that were physically braver than humans. Plenty of species were stronger, faster, more durable, better armed. But she had noticed, since arriving at the Institute, that physical strength did not seem to correlate with the willingness to use it in defense of someone else. In fact, she said, it often seemed to correlate in the opposite direction. The strongest species in the Concord were frequently the least likely to intervene when something was wrong, because they had never needed to develop the moral framework that comes from knowing what it feels like to be small. She did not say this with anger. She did not say it with accusation. She said it the way she said everything, calmly, clearly, as a simple observation about the universe she had found herself in. Then she said that humans were not strong, not by galactic standards. She said that Earth was classified as a death world, but that this classification was somewhat misleading, because it implied that humans had conquered their environment through dominance. They had not. They had survived it through stubbornness, through adaptation, through the refusal to accept that a problem was unsolvable simply because it was dangerous. She said that humans did not fight because they were powerful. They fought because they had decided, slowly and painfully over thousands of years, that strength without conscience was just cruelty, and that the measure of a species was not how much damage it could inflict, but how much damage it was willing to absorb to protect something smaller than itself. The amphitheater was very quiet when she finished. In the weeks that followed, the ripples continued to spread. The Dratha diplomatic delegation sent a formal protest to Earth's newly appointed Concord liaison, demanding restrictions on human exchange students. Earth's response was delivered by a woman named Catherine Hale, a career diplomat with gray hair and a voice like polished steel, who had arrived on the station 3 days after the hearing and had spent every moment since then having very quiet, very firm conversations with every delegation that would see her. Her public statement was measured. She acknowledged the seriousness of the incident. She expressed regret for any injuries sustained. She affirmed Earth's commitment to the principles of the Concord and to the peaceful integration of humanity into galactic society. She said that Earth would ensure all future exchange students received comprehensive briefings on interspecies protocols and cultural sensitivity. Then she said, without raising her voice, that Earth would not restrict its students from defending the lives of their classmates when institutional systems failed to do so. She said this was not negotiable. She said Earth hoped the Concord would understand. The subtext was clear to everyone in the room, and it traveled through the data net within hours. Earth was not asking for permission. Earth was not apologizing for what Marin had done. Earth was informing the galaxy, politely, but without ambiguity, that this was who they were, and that the Concord could either make room for that or discover what happened when it did not. I received my own placement results during this period. I had been accepted into the diplomatic corps, which was what I had wanted since the day I arrived at the institute. I read the notification on my datapad while sitting in the library, and I sat very still for a long time. Because I realized something that I had been avoiding admitting to myself. I had gotten what I wanted, but I had not gotten it for the reason I had expected. I had not earned it through academic excellence, or strategic networking, or any of the careful, cautious maneuvers that I had spent 2 years perfecting. I had earned it because something had changed inside me, in that seminar room, watching a human walk down a set of stairs toward a threat that should have been impossible for her to face. I had started asking different questions. I had started thinking about what the diplomatic corps was actually for, not as a career path but as a mechanism for making the galaxy less cruel, and that shift in perspective had apparently been visible in my application essays in ways that the review board found compelling. Marin had changed me. She had changed me without trying, without intending to, without even knowing she had done it, and I did not know whether to thank her or be terrified of a species that could alter the trajectory of someone's life by simply being who they were. I found her on the last day of term, at the viewport dome on the upper observation deck, the same spot where I had watched her standing alone on her first week at the institute. She was looking out at the stars again, her hands in her pockets, her reflection ghosting across the transparent alloy. But she was not alone this time. Desi was standing beside her, the small pilori pressed against Marin's hip, with the unself-conscious devotion of a creature that had decided exactly where in the universe it felt safest. Desi had declared Marin her life guardian under pilori custom, a bond that carried enormous cultural weight in pilori society, and Marin had accepted it with the gentle, slightly overwhelmed grace of someone who did not fully understand the magnitude of what had been offered, but understood enough to know it mattered. Desi saw me first and chirped a greeting. Marin turned and smiled, and it was her real smile, not the polite, careful smile she had worn during those early weeks when she was still trying to figure out where she fit. This was the smile of someone who had stopped trying to fit and had simply decided to stand where she was and let the space arrange itself around her. I told her about the diplomatic corps. She looked genuinely delighted, which was a word I had not previously associated with humans, but which seemed accurate in the moment. I told her that she had changed things, not just for the campus, not just for me, for the way I thought about strength and weakness, and what those words actually meant when you stripped away the biological determinism and looked at what was underneath. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that I have carried with me every day since. She said I was never weak. She said that fear was not weakness, cruelty was weakness, indifference was weakness. She said that I had been afraid, and that was understandable, because I lived in a body that was designed to be afraid, and fighting that design every single day just to walk through a corridor took more courage than most predator species would ever comprehend. She said that the bravest people she had ever known were the ones who were afraid all the time and kept going anyway, and that by that measure, every prey-evolved species in the Concord was braver than they had ever been given credit for. I did not know what to say to that. I am not sure there was anything to say. She reached into her bag and pulled out her notebook, the paper one with the wooden pencil marks and the slightly bent cover. She tore out a page and handed it to me. It was a drawing. She had done it in pencil, with the careful, unhurried detail of someone who draws not because they are talented, but because they find it calming. It showed the commons. Not the commons as it had been, divided and silent and afraid, but the commons as it had become. Students of a dozen species sitting together, talking, arguing, sharing meals. A Chivrin and a Velani hunched over a data display. A Meluwari, with a Pelori, perched on his tank. A cluster of species I could not immediately identify gathered around a table covered in food containers from 6 different worlds. She said she had drawn it the week after the fight. She said this was what she had come to the Institute to find. Not a fight, not a confrontation. This. The version of the galaxy where people sat together because they wanted to, not because the thing keeping them apart had finally been removed, but because someone had shown them it was possible. I took the drawing. My hands were trembling slightly, a faint crystalline vibration that Marin politely did not mention. She shouldered her bag and said goodbye. She said she would see me next term, assuming Earth sent her back, which she thought they probably would since she had accidentally become the most famous human in 3 sectors, and the diplomatic corps was apparently very interested in leveraging that. She said this with a dry humor that I had learned to recognize as distinctly human, the ability to find absurdity in your own circumstances and laugh at it rather than be crushed by it. Then she walked toward the shuttle bay. She did not hurry. Desi trotted beside her, keeping pace with short, quick steps, and I watched them go, the human and the Pelori, one small and one smaller, moving through the corridor with the easy rhythm of 2 people who had found each other and did not intend to let go. I looked down at the drawing, then I looked back up at Marin's retreating form, growing smaller with distance, framed by the long corridor and the viewport beyond it, and the immensity of a galaxy that was only just beginning to understand what it had invited in. In the years that followed, as humanity's role in the Concord grew, from probationary membership to full partnership to something that no species had quite anticipated and no political analyst had accurately predicted, scholars and diplomats and historians would argue about the turning point. Some would cite the Treaty of Palios, signed 6 years later, which granted Earth full voting rights in the Concord Assembly. Others would cite the human fleet deployment during the Vascari border crisis, when 3 Earth warships held a contested corridor for 11 days against a force that outnumbered them 40-1 and did not lose a single vessel. Others still would point to the economic integration initiatives, or the cultural exchange programs, or the joint research partnerships that produced technologies neither species could have developed alone. They would argue about it in lecture halls and diplomatic chambers and across data net channels for decades, and they would never agree, because the answer was not the kind of thing that fit neatly into a historical record or a diplomatic brief. The answer was a girl, in the back row of a classroom, who watched a system fail and decided that failure was not acceptable. A girl who studied the anatomy of every species around her because understanding seemed like the responsible thing to do. A girl who stood up when her body was not shaking and walked forward when every rational calculation said she should sit down. The turning point was not a treaty or a fleet or an economic agreement. The turning point was Marin Ortega closing her notebook, setting down her pencil, and standing up. I still have the drawing. It hangs on the wall of my office at the Diplomatic Corps headquarters on Palios 7, where I have worked for the past 12 years. Visitors sometimes ask about it. They see the pencil lines and the slightly smudged shading, and the careful, unpolished detail of a sketch made by someone who drew for comfort rather than skill, and they ask who made it and why it matters. I tell them it was drawn by a human. I tell them it shows the future, rendered in graphite on a piece of dead tree, by a girl who could see it before the rest of us even knew we were allowed to look. And then, if they have time, I tell them the story of the exchange student who closed her notebook and stood up. They always have time, everyone does, because that is the thing about humans that the galaxy learned too late and has never been able to forget. They do not conquer you with warships or trade agreements or political maneuvering. They conquer you with a piece of chocolate offered to a stranger, and a drawing torn from a notebook, and a quiet voice saying, "Put her down." They conquer you by making you believe you deserve to be saved. And the worst part, the truly terrifying part, is that they mean it.